Okay, hello and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the penultimate session in this year's Institute for Northern Studies public seminar series. It's lovely to see everyone this afternoon for this special lunchtime session. For those who don't know me, my name is Dr. Andrew Lind. I'm a lecturer here at INS, and it's my great pleasure to be chairing these sessions. Now, before we begin today and I introduce today's speaker, I just have very quick, boring points, technical points that I need to just quickly run over with everyone. The first is that today's session is being recorded, as you might have heard in the robotic voice there, and that's just so we can upload it onto the Institute for Northern Studies YouTube channel, so you'll be able to access the recording of this via that channel. The other point that I just need to make before we begin is that you're all warmly invited to submit any questions throughout the talk today and in the Q&A session afterwards, but can I ask that you input them through the chat function rather than the Q&A function on WebEx. And when you pop your questions in the chat, make sure that you address them to all panelists, and that just means that no questions are going to be left, nothing's fallen through the gaps, and I can pick them up in the Q&A session and put them to our speaker. So that's all the technical stuff out the way. Now on to the main event. Today's speaker is the only academic that I know of who genuinely has a fan following, such is her rock star status in the field. And it is, of course, our very own Professor Mairéad Mccreath. Now, Mairéad is a Professor of Public Folklore here at UHI, before which she held several positions at universities across the globe, including Liverpool, Heriot-Watt, Göttingen, Exeter, Ulster, and Harvard. She's also worked with international bodies, including the UN, UNESCO, and the European Centre for Minority Issues. Her research covers a range of topics, but can perhaps best be summarised as focusing on heritage, culture, language, place, and identity. Professor NicCraith's paper today will touch on several of these aspects and is titled The Convention for the Protection of the Intangible Cultural Heritage, Resistance, Challenge and Opportunity. Welcome, Mairéad.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the people who came. And I can see in the audience many people who I would regard as real experts in the field of intangible cultural heritage. And what I'd like to do today is just briefly cover what's in the convention and then explore why some state parties are reluctant to sign the convention. And that is not necessarily to suggest that they don't care about their intangible cultural heritage, because very often they do, but to look and tease out a little bit the reasons why they might be reluctant to sign the convention, and then to think about ways we might gently persuade them towards the path of ratification of the Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage. So to begin by looking at the definition of intangible cultural heritage, I think if I were to use one word to sum it up, it would be process. So in 2006, UNESCO's Convention for the Protection of ICH, I'll call it from now on, entered into force, and at that time 30 states had ratified it. Since that time, 150 more state parties have ratified it, so we're now at 180 state parties to the Convention for the Protection of the ICH. And it defines ICH, and ICH is a little bit unfortunate because it was a compromise word, but it means the practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, as well as the instruments, objects, artifacts, and cultural spaces. And I find the notion of cultural spaces particularly interesting as part of ICH, that communities, groups, and in some cases individuals recognize as part of their cultural heritage. And that latter part, the self-identification by communities and groups and individuals, is particularly important. And the convention has divided the skills and the processes into 5 domains. So the first one is oral traditions and expressions, including language as a medium for transmission of ICH. The second one is performing arts, Then we have social practices, rituals, and festive events. One that is vastly underestimated in the current time of climate change and sustainability is knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe. And finally, a very important one, traditional craftsmanship. So these are the domains into which ICH is divided. And within that, obviously, there are a lot of subcategories. Now, before going on to look at this convention in particular, I want to place it in the context of two other closely related conventions. And the first one is the Convention Concerning the Protection of the World Cultural and Natural Heritage in 1972. So that was about that was a number of decades before the ICH one, and one that came very quickly after the ICH one was the Convention of the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions. Now, if I'd like to just compare the conventions, just to specify more clearly what the ICH one is about, the World Heritage 1972 one is the one most people are familiar with. That's the kind of heritage that gives world status. So we're talking about castles, manors, we're talking about monuments, etc. And that talks about the conservation of immovable heritage and places. So it's not called tangible heritage, but it really is about tangible heritage. And that contrasts with the ICH one, which is much more about expressions, skills, practices, and knowledge. So the things you can't touch. A second point is that world heritage is divided into cultural heritage and or natural heritage. But in the Intangible Convention, the social dimension. So we're back to the people who self-identify or who identify heritage as being theirs is an extremely important dimension. In the World Heritage Convention, if something is inscribed on the list, it is regarded as having outstanding universal value. And in that sense, it belongs to the world. That's why it's called World Heritage. It's too grand and too outstanding to belong to any particular nation. In contrast, the Intangible Heritage talks about representative value. So we are talking about a skill that is representative of a particular community, but that hierarchy of outstanding isn't there. It's about what the communities define as being relevant to them. In the World Heritage Convention, there's a lot of emphasis on authenticity and integrity, and very often I think sites don't realize that if they get World Heritage status, that can put quite a lot of restrictions on development around the site, because they would be threatened with removal of the status if they do something that threatens the integrity of the site. We saw that happening with the Liverpool waterfront lately, where the economic development around the waterfront was regarded as having destroyed the integrity of the site itself. In contrast, with intangible heritage, there is a sense of dynamism and a sense of change. It's kind of the same, but it's kind of different. It's like Hamish Henderson's flowing stream. It passes on from one generation to the next, not exactly in the same way, but there is an essential core that is passed on. Now, if I take the other two conventions, the Cultural Diversity Convention and the Intangible Heritage Convention, people are often less familiar with the cultural diversity dimension. But the cultural diversity dimension is very much about cultural activities, goods, and services. So there's more an emphasis on product, unlike the intangible heritage one, which is much more about skills, practices, expressions, and knowledge. The Cultural Diversity Convention is very often at an individual level. So we talk about the creative industries, and we talk quite a lot about the creative industries or the cultural industries. That really relates back to the Cultural Diversity Convention. Whereas ICH is much more about the community, it's about the group practice, but it's also about that practice being transmitted over at least one generation, whereas the cultural expressions can be brand new. And the third dimension is the Cultural Diversity Convention. The focus is on dissemination and development, whereas in the ICH Convention, the focus is on safeguarding and transmission. Now, what is interesting about these three conventions is that the UK has signed and ratified 2 out of the 3. So the UK ratified the World Heritage Convention in 1984 and has quite a number of World Heritage sites. It interestingly also ratified the Cultural Diversity Convention in 2007. And this may be partly to do with Tony Blair's agenda of the cultural industries. It's also, I think, partly to do with the recognition that the cultural and creative industries were adding a huge amount to the creative economy. And the cultural sector now accounts for more than 6% of the global economy. And I think people forget that. They often think of culture as something that needs to be subsidized or needs to be helped. But actually, culture and the creative industries are a net contributor. And worldwide, this sector creates nearly 30 million jobs, and it employs more people aged 15 to 29 than any other sectors. So if people take culture seriously, they are talking about more inclusive economic growth, reducing inequalities, and also helping the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Now, if a country were to ratify the convention, what would it involve? It would involve a number of actions. One would be to take measures to safeguard intangible cultural heritage in their nation states. It would be along with the communities and NGOs, and this is very important, it's supposed to come from the bottom up, to identify and define appropriate forms of ICH. The job of inventorying is the one most people are familiar with. So states are invited to nominate elements of intangible cultural heritage within their territory to either a register or 2 lists. And one is the list of intangible cultural heritage in need of urgent safeguarding, so that is ICH at risk. The next is the representative list of the ICH of humanity. So what intangible cultural heritage is representative of different communities. And the third one is the register of best safeguarding practices. So are there examples of safeguarding ICH within our nation state that we feel would be beneficial for other countries to look at? There is also an obligation to contribute to the ICH fund. Now, this is a fund designed to help ICH in need. And every nation state contributes to it, but it is also entitled to apply for the funding back. Now, there is a sort of gentleman's agreement, in inverted commas, that the richer countries don't actually look for that money back, that it is more for countries in need, but everyone actually who ratifies the convention is entitled to apply for that funding. And then there's an obligation to report when required to the UNESCO committee, and that is not very onerous. It's every 4 or 6 years. So if you are listing a practice or a skill that is in urgent, that is at risk, you report every 4 years. And if you are offering a practice or a skill that is just on the representative list, you report every 6 years on how that is going. And who does it affect? Who are the stakeholders? Well, these conventions basically affect everybody. They affect state parties, central and local governments, communities, groups and individuals. They affect NGOs and organizations such as the Crafts Organization or Tracks or any of the cultural organizations that we are familiar with. Academics and researchers have a vested interest in them. Museums and cultural sectors have an interest in them, and schools and non-formal education and also universities have an interest in them. So that's really my setting of the context for the Convention for ICH. So now I want to look at why some countries are reluctant to sign. Now, I should say that I haven't the figure exactly in front of me, but I think it's 180 state parties have already signed it. So quite a very high proportion of state parties to UNESCO have signed it. Ones that haven't signed it are, for example, the UK. Ireland only signed it a few years ago. Australia hasn't signed it, the US, Canada, and there are a few more. So why are they not signing it, or what is their reluctance? Sometimes probably they just don't care. But I think in most cases that is actually not true. They are actually motivated by interest in and concern for the intangible cultural heritage within their nation state. Some people object to the definition of heritage in the convention. And what they're objecting to is the kind of parallel lines that are being drawn between the World Heritage Convention, which emphasized the physical dimension of heritage with monuments, buildings, and sites, versus the intangible heritage, which is more about skills, processes, and practices. Now, some people have said that the World Heritage Convention is very Eurocentric in its approach and in its definition of World Heritage, whereas intangible cultural heritage has very much been influenced by Asia. Now, people say, well, really, all heritage is a bit of both, isn't it? It's neither World Heritage completely, nor is it completely intangible heritage. So, for example, if you have a dance, well, you have the material culture, perhaps, of the costumes, and you also have the dance, which is the skill. And some people, like New Zealand, have said, we really can't go along with this, because if we take Maori cultural heritage within our territories, this is really bound up with the life essence which underpins the nature of all culture and heritage. And I think what they're objecting to is the compartmentalization of heritage. And personally, I would agree that that is problematic. However, I think not to go ahead and sign the Convention for the Intangible Cultural Heritage is to do a disservice to that dimension of heritage. Now, elsewhere, Uli and I have talked about a holistic approach to heritage, which we call the Tao of Heritage. And we think this definition is appropriate because yin and yang are not adversarial. Instead, they're adversarial. They are mutually contingent and conditioned. And there is always a certain fluidity going on. However, until such time as we have a convention that addresses heritage in a holistic way, I feel that not to ratify the ICH convention is to miss out on a huge part of heritage, which is very important to ordinary people. Now, a second objection some people have to signing and ratifying the convention is the question of language. And I said earlier in my domains that language is recognized within the convention as a mechanism of intangible cultural heritage. So it's regarded as a means of transmitting folklore or folk customs or traditional knowledge, but not in and of itself. And New Zealand again have raised this objection saying, well, the Maori language is heritage. And if we ratify the convention in its current state, we are not recognizing the Maori language as heritage. We are demeaning it in some shape or form. Now, there is a problem with, I think, the way heritage is described is in the Intangible Cultural Heritage. And that problem goes back to the time when the convention was being put together. And that is, for some state parties, language is political, or for some groups, language is a political issue. Not necessarily for the people speaking the language themselves. Very often, the politics of language is something that's imposed from outside rather than within. But there are some regions, there are some countries, for example, Spain, might have been much more reluctant to ratify the convention if language were explicitly recognized as heritage in and of itself. So that is a valid concern, but it is not a valid reason for not ratifying the convention. I think some state parties are getting language in by the back door. So we have examples of whistling language, etc., already being ratified within the convention. A third objection some people have, some states, is the whole obligation of inventorying. And they say, well, this is all very well. We have two lists and a register, the urgent safeguarding list, the representative list, and then the register of best practice. But what about all the time we're going to spend putting that list together? Wouldn't that time be better spent actually managing the cultural practices rather than putting them on the list? There is also the objection that some people, and this is more Australia than New Zealand, have noted the problematic nature of the listing process for Indigenous peoples, because they say, well, for some Indigenous peoples, their traditional knowledge is sacred, and there may be issues of privacy and access which are raised if you were talking about listing. And people have also said that there's a kind of a value judgment going on here. So, for example, if Beltane in Edinburgh makes it to the list and Beltane in Dingle in Ireland doesn't make it to the list, are we saying that Beltane in Edinburgh is better? But actually, I think that's missing the point in several ways. The first point about the list is a starting point and not an end point. And I think the people who object to the time spending on the list don't realize that the lists are springboards for further safeguarding, not a list that is a conclusion to a process. And the second point is that if a practice or a skill is placed on the list, that is not like the World Heritage Convention, where we are saying this is outstanding universal value. We are saying this is representative of a particular group, of a particular community in a particular place and time. And if there are issues about not putting certain practices on the list, well, then I think the answer is, if the communities themselves don't want it on the list, then it shouldn't be there. I think the people who make the argument about Indigenous communities' knowledge being sacred and not being on the list are missing the point that it is the Indigenous communities who decide whether it should go on the list or not, and not the state parties. Now, to go on to what I call the assertions, some people are saying, well, why would we bother ratifying the convention? Sure, aren't we almost doing it anyway? And the first thing I would say that it is absolutely true that Scotland is magnificent at looking after its intangible cultural heritage. Now, it may not have used the language of intangible cultural heritage, but it has used the language of folklore. It has examples of Tobar an Dúlchais. We have examples of oral histories, and Scotland has a huge expertise in managing intangible cultural heritage. And Scotland also has a kind of a list, which is that in 2008, the former Scottish Museums Council, which is now Museums Galleries Scotland, commissioned a report on intangible cultural heritage in Scotland, which recommended the use of a wiki as a database of living cultural practices and knowledge. And the idea behind the database was that ordinary people would add elements to the database, and also that it would be evolving, it would change, it would be dynamic. Now, there are mixed views about the success or otherwise of the database, but the point about this fulfillment by proxy, as I call it, is the same as I have just previously made. That on the database, we have the list, but what then? Whereas in the ICH Convention, if a government places a practice on one of the international lists, then it has made an obligation to safeguard that practice. And every 4 to 6 years, it will be reporting back to UNESCO on how that practice is being safeguarded. And I think this is the really important point, that whatever kind of lists we make ourselves, they're not state commitments. Whereas the ICH lists and register are actually state commitments, which is what is needed. Now, the second point that people say is, sure, we're able to collaborate with all these people anyway, and we have a number of non-governmental organizations that are already collaborating with the organs of the convention in terms of what might be on the agenda or not. Now, here I've just put up the organs of the convention: the General Assembly, which is the sovereign body of the convention, and all state parties are members of that. Then there is the Intergovernmental Committee, which has 24 state members, and that changes every 4 years, so that you get on that committee for 4 years, but then another state party gets on it, and then obviously you have the Secretariat. Now, countries which have not ratified the convention cannot participate in the organs of the convention. What they can do is, there are accredited NGOs in the UK who can advise. So they can suggest to a state party, it would be a good idea if, or we think this is the way forward. But they're not actually members of the club, in inverted commas. They are not part of the decision-making forum. And I believe, particularly for Scotland, that given the breadth of expertise that we have in the field, it's a crying shame that we are not at the table discussing future policy and planning for intangible cultural heritage. Now, a third argument I would make in favour of ratifying the convention is what I call a moral argument. And this is, I illustrate this in relation to my native language, which is Irish. And we have two terms for heritage in Irish. We have Oidhreacht and we have Dúchas. And Oidhreacht is more equivalent to world heritage. It's heritage from the top down. Dúchas, and there's a very similar word in Scots Gaelic, is more heritage from the bottom up. It's community-led heritage. Now, at the moment, Oireacht is protected and safeguarded by the World Heritage Convention, but our Dúchas is not. And it's a question of bringing those two together and recognizing that heritage from the bottom up is as important and is as in need of safeguarding as heritage from the top down. So where are we now in Scotland? First of all, I would like to draw attention to a report that came out in July 2021, Mapping Intangible Cultural Heritage Assets and Collections in Scotland. It was commissioned by the bodies across the top. I have Steve Byrne's photo there because Steve Byrne did the work on this. And this is an absolutely fantastic snapshot of where we are at this moment in time in intangible cultural heritage. It lists what the universities are doing, the various organizations. There has been a wide range of consultation, and my understanding is that going forward, the bodies that were involved in commissioning this document are thinking about where do we go from here in terms of intangible cultural heritage in Scotland. But I think, and we are already trying to do more, we're trying to think about what are we losing by not ratifying the convention. And here I'm trying to think about how we could persuade governments that ratification of the convention is important. And I think one of the first aspects is the listing. This is the one that people always think of. So if we had ratified the convention, we could propose aspects of British intangible cultural heritage for the list. Like, for example, Belgium has beer brewing, Portugal has the cowbells, there's bagpipe culture in Slovenia, there's summer solstice fire festivals in the Pyrenees, there's traditional violin making in Italy, and we can think of loads of examples in all parts of the UK that could be put forward for this list. Now, if you're on this list, I've already said you're getting a government commitment to safeguard your heritage. So the list is a starting point, but it is also giving visibility to your skill or your practice. And it's giving visibility not just at a UK level, but at a global level, because many of us visit that list on a regular basis. And often, if people are thinking about developing a skill in a particular area, they will go and see if there are other countries that have already ratified the convention and named that skill. As an example of that, we recently in the INS got funding for a PhD scholarship on dry stone walling. Now, as part of our preparation for that application, we went and looked at the ICH convention and the state parties, and we could see that a range of countries across Europe had put together a collaborative application to get their dry stone walling recognised as a practice on the ICH list, and moreover, a collaborative team together to get a globally recognised training course in dry stone walling. And this was part of the UNESCO inventory. And it's a shame that our skill isn't on that list as well. There is also a momentum that, when you get on that list, people give it more value. People who might previously not have given it value are now more interested in what's happening. And as an example of that, 2 years ago in Peru, skills about making pottery were inscribed on the ICH list. And when the inscription came out, there was a national celebration for about 2 weeks. And it was as big, they said, as if Peru had won the Football World Cup. Well, I doubt that, but that's the way they described it. But after getting on the list, all of a sudden, everybody was interested. The universities were thinking about, well, how can we bring this into our courses? Research centres and cultural associations started organising symposia and meetings about the skills. Communities started to prepare files for other skills and practices and said, well, if that can make it to the list, so can our skill. Let's think about what we can bring to the list. There's also a commitment to surveying by ratification. So as I've noted recently, we've had an excellent survey of ICH in Scotland, but that is just Scotland. What about the UK? And do we know what ICH is being lost while we are sitting around thinking about whether or not we would ratify it? Can we say that the last scissor factory or the last grinder in Sheffield will close down and that we won't know about it? That wouldn't happen with a building. If a building starts falling down, people notice it. But if a skill starts disappearing, very often people don't notice it until it is too late. And that is where the safeguarding issue is really important, because it means we are now watching that skill, keeping an eye on it, checking how it's going to be transmitted and taken forward to the future. There is also a place branding going with the skill. So, for example, if you think of basket making, you might think of the Cotswolds, or if you think of crafts, you might think of Ruskin Mill. So I think there is a place branding and a place identity that goes with these skills. There is also the dialogue that occurs between the community and the nation states, and also between communities in one country and communities in another. And I've already mentioned about the training course that's being put together for dry stone walling by a range of different countries. And then, as I've said previously, there is the opportunity to apply for international assistance if we so wish. So that brings me almost to a close, and to think about how would we persuade Westminster to ratify the convention? Well, it is an ongoing process, and there have already been many bodies and communities dealing with this. Are there more arguments that we could put up? I think there are. I mean, I think I have made a lot of them already. One of the arguments I think that is underappreciated is the role of ICH to tackle climate change. Because there's a lot of traditional knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge that is contained within communities that deals with climate change at a local way that is being lost. There's also, we could point to how important intangible cultural heritage can be to address social and cultural challenges. And I'm thinking in particular of integration issues and migration and new communities, and how sharing experiences of intangible cultural heritage can bring people together who previously may not have been together. I think there's an important issue for rural development as well, because a lot of the intangible cultural heritage does take place in the rural. Now, it also happens in the urban, but the urban very often has an infrastructure that can help it in a way that the rural doesn't necessarily. So I think the rural development point is a persuasive one. There are economic opportunities, and the Heritage Crafts Association have done wonderful work actually on pointing out the economic opportunities provided by ICH. And of course, it's not too difficult to imagine the tourism opportunities there are for festivals, for food skills, and for music, etc., that could arise from safeguarding of ICH. Perhaps the most important point, or the most important lever we can push, is the government's current levelling up agenda. And that brings me back to the Aireacht versus Dúchas that I had a little while back. So the Aireacht heritage from above, the Dúchas heritage from below. Well, by safeguarding the community's heritage, or the heritage from below, that could easily be part of the levelling up agenda. And I think that's probably the biggest argument we can make at the moment. So overall, I mean, I think intangible cultural heritage is a form of cultural capital that's a powerful driver for development. It deals with issues such as food security, health, education, sustainable use of natural resources. There's a wealth of knowledge about um, these issues contained in practices and skills held by communities. There's also a gender issue that needs to be addressed. What role do women play in the transmission of intangible cultural heritage? And are there some practices that specifically exclude some gender? It's ICH is very important for maintaining cultural diversity in an age of homogenization and globalization. Understanding intangible cultural heritage contributes to intercultural dialogue. It encourages mutual respect and social cohesion. And given the significance to its communities, it is a core part of the social and economic effects of the knowledge and the skills that are transmitted by ordinary people in everyday life. Thank you. And now I stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Mairéad. So much there to think about and to mull over. We've just got a couple of questions popping into the chat just now, and just to remind everyone that you're welcome to pop questions to Mairéad via the chat, and we can read them out. But we've got one waiting for us, so we'll kick off from there. And this is from Daniel Carpenter. Do we know whether we are about to lose practices in the domain of traditional craftsmanship UK-wide thanks to the Heritage Crafts Red List of Endangered Crafts? Scissor making is categorised as critically endangered.
Yes, I think, Daniel, you probably could answer that question much better than me because you're really the expert in this area. But I do think that the Heritage Crafts Association has done absolutely fantastic work in identifying what crafts are endangered and what crafts are safe for now. So I think to a certain extent, we do know. But how widely beyond that craft association that awareness goes is I'm not so sure about. I'm not so sure about the everyday person on the street. Do they know, for example, that scissors making is critically endangered? Piano making, as I believe, is critically endangered. Kilt making, I believe, is critically endangered. I think this would be the work that is being done at the moment by organisations like the Heritage Crafts Associations is fantastic. But what I think you and I would like is something much more coordinated at UK-wide level that would bring all these questions and issues together.
Excellent. Daniel's just following up on that, saying, not yet, but we're getting there. We've had some great media coverage lately.
Yes.
There's so much more to do.
Yes.
Yeah, excellent. I'll just give people a chance to type questions into the chat just now, and I'll abuse my position as chair, as I'm wont to do, to ask a few questions just kind of out of ignorance more than anything else, Mairéad. You mentioned some of the barriers to the kind of the protection and long-term safety of intangible heritage. Are there any model countries or kind of model case studies where this is being done very well, and that's kind of the model that other countries or approach that other countries should adopt? You mentioned Scotland there in terms of the report, but are there any others there that you would highlight?
Well, one of the things I've been looking at is how the countries that have ratified the convention, what kind of models they have brought in. Some of them, I mean, what they usually do is they appoint an advisory body and they appoint an institution to look after the managing of the whole process. But some of them have taken the different domains of intangible cultural heritage and built a model based around these nodes, as we might call them, and say, well, there's a group looking after the language and songs and bits, and there's another group looking after the performance, etc. If the UK were to take it forward, I would imagine the best way would be for each nation state within the UK to have its own committee to look after intangible cultural heritage, and to take that forward. A lot of countries are particularly good at looking after their intangible cultural heritage. Um, Maybe not always for good reasons. I mean, sometimes states look after intangible cultural heritage because they want to claim it for the nation state rather than part of the local communities. But I think a lot of European countries, I mean, I think Finland looks after it very well. I think Germany looks after it very well. I think a lot of European countries tend to look after their intangible cultural heritage and appreciate it more, I think, than others.
And is there still this kind of issue of room for abuse because of the kind of mercurial definition of intangible heritage and the associated aspects of that? Is there still issues in terms of, like you say, states using it for ulterior motives? And is there any way to get around that, or is that just kind of the nature of the beast?
It's a bit of the nature of the beast, but one of the things that I would say is that there are very firm ethical guidelines about what can be approved on the list and what can't. So anything that is in contravention of human rights, no matter how much the community suggests they want it to be on the list, will not go on the list. So there is a filtering process through which to ensure that nothing that goes on the list contravenes human rights. The second issue is that in theory and in principle, it's communities put it forward. So in other words, states should not be controlling the process. Of course, the reality is that it's a bit of both, because ultimately it's the state that makes the nomination, but they have to evidence that the community were supportive of the nomination. But so it's a little bit of both, but there is that definite filter there about non-contravention of human rights, that anything that isn't ethical can't go on the list.
Okay. We've got a question here from Zoe Russell. Do you have any thoughts on how Historic Environments Scotland have been approaching ICH in practice?
I do. I think they've been doing a good job, actually. I think they've been doing an excellent job. I think that I mean, first of all, I should say that the dry stone walling PhD studentship that we have funding for at the moment is in association with Historic Environment Scotland. I think it's a big change in mentality. So I'm not saying everybody in Historic Environment Scotland embraces ICH. And there is an inevitable tension between people who are very committed to the built environment and people who are committed to intangible cultural heritage, partly to do with a fear of financial resources. That if ICH gets recognised, does that mean there's less money for building conservation, etc.? But there are certainly sterling individuals within ICH, and I know that there's a working group within HES. Sorry, there's an ICH working group within HES, which is really endeavouring to push the agenda forward and to push the ICH as part of the broader picture. The other thing I would say is that that report that was done by Steve Byrne last year, HES was one of the parties to that report. So they are involved in the wider conversation.
Okay. Is there an issue in terms of not pointing fingers at HES, but organizations like that where there's a commercial consideration where ICH is difficult to, or is perceived to be difficult to make commercially viable in order to sell that?
Yeah, I mean there is a difficulty generally that people think that cultural matters need subsidizing. So for example, if you take an English medium school and a Gaelic medium school, people will ask, you know, how much is the Gaelic medium school costing? But they rarely will ask how much is the English medium school costing. So anything that isn't the majority is perceived as a cost. So that's one issue. And the second issue is that very often the contribution that cultural matters make to the economy is not always understood and not always recognized. And I think the economic dimension to culture is greatly underestimated and understudied.
Mhm. Let me just have a quick look at the chat. So we've got a comment here from Carly Williams, actually picking up on the point I made about ulterior motives. In the reporting process, once an element is listed by UNESCO, the evaluation committee will also flag up if it seems like the state is not acting in the best interests
Yeah,
of ICH element or the community, which
yeah,
is good to know.
yes.
Okay.
So there is that ethical process.
Yeah.
It's not just a question of putting forward um, anything, and if the communities value it and the state pushes it, it goes on the list. There is a whole filtering process, um, and it's a slow process, and this is one of the issues that I think, if the UK ever were to sign it, how do we resource communities to make that nomination process? Because
Yeah.
there's a big form to be filled in. There's a whole load of signatories and various other issues that need to be got. So the resourcing of communities, I think, is going to have to come into that in due course.
Mhm. We've got another comment from Daniel picking up on your point about the levelling up and whether that's an aspect that could be tapped into here. Daniel said, the Westminster government is focused on this idea of levelling up. However much we believe in their commitment to this, is this something that can align with the ratification of ICH?
Well, I think, Daniel, you and I would see it as yes.
Mhm.
Um, we've got to get them to see it as part of the levelling up agenda. And of course, this model that I talked about, Oidhreacht versus Dúchas, heritage from top down, heritage from bottom up, doesn't really exist in the English language. Heritage is heritage, and you
Yeah.
put something in front of it, it's world heritage or intangible cultural heritage or something else. But that distinction hasn't got into the mindset of everybody. But I think the case can be made. And I think the UK government, along with the other governments that haven't yet signed or ratified the convention, it's a question of chipping away, keeping making the argument.
Mhm.
And I think, but I do think the levelling up agenda does offer an opportunity at the moment that perhaps we didn't have previously.
Again, this is a point out of my own ignorance, but in terms of the political obstacles or considerations in the UK, for example, is there a political element here that needs to be acknowledged or tackled where elements of ICH from Scotland, Wales, Ireland are seen as not particularly attractive for certain Westminster governments to engage with? And likewise, you mentioned the example of Spain, and you could say Spain and Catalonia, for example. Is that something that needs to be carefully considered and how?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of this requires careful management, and I think
Yeah.
very neutral language. I mean, there's always the issue that culture can be um, portrayed as political even
Mhm.
when it isn't. So, it might be seen as, the politicization of culture. People who say, talking about Welsh speakers, and they say, well, they spoke Welsh on purpose in order to exclude me, rather than thinking actually they spoke Welsh because that's the language they use all the time. So there are issues about the politicization of culture that can happen, and I think it's careful management to ensure that those perceptions are removed. There is also perhaps the consideration of areas of previous conflict. So how, for example, would one manage ICH in Northern Ireland, where, for example, the Orange Order might want their parades as ICH, and how do you manage that kind of situation? So there are political tensions that need to be addressed. And I think there's also the question, and this is 15 years old now, but Laura Jane Smith, when she was doing research on intangible cultural heritage in England at the time, she said, why are you not ratifying the Charter or the Convention? And they said, because we don't have intangible cultural heritage in England. So I think there's a lack of recognition and understanding, and this is due to the awkwardness of the phrase ICH. It's a
Mhm.
very awkward phrase. It's quite meaningless, but if you said, well, cricket is ICH, or, people think of Morris dancing, but they don't think of cricket or calligraphy or other issues, skills that are part of the ICH. So I think it's a question of broadening the understanding of ICH and depoliticizing elements that may be perceived as political.
Yeah. Okay. There's still time for a couple questions if anyone is interested. I'll just
Or comments.
or comments.
Yeah.
Oh, there's actually there's one in the Q&A box. I'll just get it up quickly. This is from Christina. In an event organised by the RSA recently, a DCMS representative answered the question on why the UK hasn't ratified the convention yet by saying that they haven't seen a convincing business model that would highlight the benefits. What would Professor Mccreath say in reply to such a comment?
And again, Christina is as much an expert in ICH as I am. I think the business model is easily made, and the business model is this, that the cost of ratifying the convention is about 150,000 a year. Now, in the Westminster budget, 150,000 is buttons. In terms of the profit that can be made, I mean, I think one of the issues we need to look at, and I'm aware Christina is already doing this, is looking at what the skills and practices bring beyond the skills and practices themselves. So, for example, if you look at watchmaking in Switzerland, which is part of the ICH list, they say it's important, not just because they make good watches, but because the people who make them are very excellent, precise skills. They have a lot of transferable skills like punctuality, dependency. They have an economic contribution to make. So I think it's a question of thinking about the broader picture of ICH. At the moment, the focus is too much on the culture, which seems to exclude all the other social aspects of ICH. But the actual cost is about 150,000. Then, of course, there will be other costs as we go along in time. But for example, if I come back to my dry stone walling opportunity, if you take the fact that 5 or 6 countries are coming together, and as a result of their listing are developing a training course for dry stone wallers, which will be recognized across all those countries, there is definitely an economic opportunity there that we're missing out on. So it's a question of finding more of those.
I think that actually links into a point that Daniel's just made in the chat, where he's asked, should we produce a concise document on how ICH addresses all the major agendas? At Heritage Crafts, we have an online event coming up about how the critically endangered ICH practice of witty pot making is being revived in parallel with the environmental sustainability agenda.
I think the sustainability agenda is a huge one. That is underestimated at the moment, the value of ICH. Because if you look at a lot of the ICH practices on the list, they talk about taking local resources, taking as much as they need, but not more than they need, using materials that are not harming the environment. So there is a whole ethos among a lot of the communities that are involved in ICH of the sustainability agenda. There's a big understanding of the sustainability agenda that people not involved in ICH are missing. And I think that the environmental sustainability is a key aspect of ICH that needs more attention.
Okay, we do have time for a final question if anyone has been sitting on something that they'd like to ask or comment upon. I mean, I really don't envy you. It sounds just like there's going to be a huge education campaign, if nothing else, just to get people in the positions that we've mentioned
Yes,
thinking about ICH.
but I mean, a lot of groups are already involved in
Yeah.
it. So, in Scotland, you have Museums Gallery Scotland, you have Tracks, you have SAHA, you have the Crafts Association, and it's a question of and they're increasingly working together, I think, on making the case and making the argument. And I think it's just a question of chipping away, and sooner or later, we will get there, but it may take some time.
Okay, I'll give it another minute, see if anyone's furiously typing. I don't want to cut anyone off. Oh, Carly's just popped in the chat there. It's a big campaign in marketing just on the terminology itself, and then making the case for the side of culture that isn't as glamorous as castles. Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yes. Yes, I agree.
Yeah. Daniel just saying thank you so much. It's been a really useful session.
Thank you.
And Mairéad is indeed a rock star. Okay. Well, in that case, I'll just bring things to a close. I'd like to just invite everyone first and foremost in our traditional awkward online round of applause for Mairéad for a fantastic paper and a really excellent discussion after that as well. So thank you very much, Mairéad.
And
I'll
thank you
clap
for
on behalf of
coming.
everyone.
I know it's lunch hour. Thank you.
All that's left for me to do is, actually, first off, Mairéad, do you just want to quickly give everyone a few more details about this PhD project, which is currently looking
Yes,
for
I'm
candidates?
going to put my email in the chat, and I know some people here have already circulated it. There is a week to go where we have an opportunity for a fully funded PhD studentship on the skill of dry stone walling in the Scottish Islands. And it will be done in a comparative context with one of the other countries on the UNESCO list. And between now and next week, anybody who's interested needs to put in a CV and an expression of interest. And that's all that we're asking for because we recognize the time is tight. So if you know of anyone who might be interested, please circulate my email and I will be happy to get in touch with them and give them the link.
Perfect. Fantastic opportunity as well.
Thank you.
So all that's left for me to do is to warmly invite everyone back next time for our final seminar of the term, which will be our very own Professor Ulrich Cockle, who will be discussing similar themes to those we've just heard about today. And his paper, Across the Fundamental Field in the European North, lunchtime tongue twister. Ethnological perspectives on Indigenous knowledge and land-based learning for sustainability. And that will be on the 26th of May at this lunchtime slot of 1 p.m. But until then, thank you to everyone for attending today. A massive thank you to Mairéad for a fantastic paper, and we'll see you all again in a few weeks' time. Enjoy the rest of your day.